Today's episode is a result of a request I put out a couple of months back for people who worked in the space industry, and is an interview with ex IBM and NASA contractor Kenneth Roberts, who worked on the Saturn V, Skylab, Spacelab and also the Space Shuttle, and helped train the crews and astronauts to understand and use the custom-made flight and operational computer systems. I'd also like to thank Tennis Smith in setting up the interview and also for suggesting it in the first place. So without further ado, here is the interview, and look out for some interesting reveals towards the end. Welcome Kenneth Roberts to Curious Droid. Now, Kenneth worked at IBM from 1968 after you graduated, if I believe, then on through the latter part. You missed the Apollo missions, but you worked then with the Skylab, Spacelab, and then on into the Shuttle, and probably up into the late 70s, early 80s then, I presume?
Yes, Paul,
Yeah.
it's about the middle 80s when I
Middle 80s when you moved from there, yeah. So how did you end up, or how did you get into NASA? Because you said you finished up with a degree in applied mathematics. How did you get into NASA and then end up on some of these actual programs?
Well, Paul, it's kind of the luck of the draw, I guess. At Auburn, where I was getting a master's degree in applied mathematics, I studied in graduate school a subject called celestial mechanics. That's orbital mechanics.
Yep.
That was of interest to IBM. So when I graduated, they were one of the companies that I interviewed with. Well, they had a job in Huntsville, which was close to my home. So it just all fell together. That's right. I had some other offers, but I chose that one and went to work for IBM, who just happened to have, and the reason they were hiring as much, the contracts for all the flight computers and flight software for the NASA programs of that day.
Right. So you landed sort of really just at the right place at the right time.
Absolutely.
With the right information. And then obviously once you're in NASA, you're then into really the sort of the front end of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right place at the right time, Paul.
Exactly.
And I was kind of awed by the environment, because IBM had gone out and they had recruited the big schools, the Dukes, the Caltechs, the MITs in this country. And here I was, old country boy from North Alabama, from Auburn, and I was kind of awed with the talent of the people that IBM had attracted there. But this was new. It was all new to me. It was new to the other guys, and luckily we had some senior level people involved there that could help the people like myself just coming on board to learn the trade, so to speak, because it was all new. Computers were new.
Yeah.
Computers, this was a whole new field of computer applications.
Yes, because at the time, MIT got the contract to develop the Apollo guidance computer, which I'd imagine might have put IBM's nose out of joint a little bit, because obviously they were the main computer contractor, but they got like this key job. So all that was absolutely brand new and nobody had ever done it before.
Absolutely, Paul. It was all new. It was man-rated software. There's never been such a thing as that.
Yeah.
That's why there was more than 50% of the total budget for these programs went into test and integration.
Yeah. So man-rated means, explain what man-rated means.
Man-rated means that there was lives at stake.
Right.
The lives of the crew depended on the success of this. A failure would mean loss of life.
Right.
And so we tested and retested, and I wound up in that test and integration group.
Right.
And we, what was known as triple modular redundant, all the mission critical sensors were in triplicate, and our software had to take the inputs from all three of the sources, do some analysis to determine if there was a problem at all in any of them. If they disagree, if one of them disagreed from the other two by more than a tolerance, we'd kick that one out.
Right.
It was a because we had the system set up so that we could have two failures and still function and operate in a safe environment.
Right, yeah. So this is where the multiple systems come from.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
So now you started off doing some programming, but then you moved more to the actual training of the astronauts and the crew that would be actually using it. So how did you sort of get into that area there? Because obviously you came in with applied mathematics, you've done programming. How did you end up sort of being a sort of interface with the crew?
It was because we had a team of people, and those that were programmers, Paul, they focused on a single functional area of the software. It might be the guidance system. It might be the control system. It might be the redundancy management system. But those that programmed focused on one isolated functional area of the software.
Right.
But those who did test and integration had to know a little bit about all of the systems, because you were testing inputs that supported all the different systems. So that guy, and I was one of those guys, had a broader view of what the total system was doing.
Yeah.
And certainly with the interfaces, with the user interface.
Yeah.
So we were the logical choices then to train the crew on what they were going to see during the mission.
Yeah.
And that's how I wound up in that group.
I see. Yes, yes. So obviously you've got a wider range of knowledge, so you'll know that rather than one guy who's just concentrating on just one part and might not be very good at sort of telling that to other people, because I know programmers and some of them are quite introverted and they don't want to talk to other people.
Exactly. And by virtue of being in that group, that sent me to Johnson Space Center for the training sessions. It sent me to Kennedy Space Center for the test and integration that was done in advance of the flight.
Right.
So I got a little bit involved in that, maybe a little more so than some of the other engineers did at that time.
Yeah. So you were saying when you worked on some of the later systems, which would be the Skylab and things like that, it would be all done in situ. So that would be in the launch assembly building. That's the big building where they build the rocket itself. So you would test everything in there prior to the thing rolling out and then actually launching, which wouldn't be very far away.
Exactly. They would have, in the vehicle assembly building, they would have everything. They've got the vehicle, they've got all the interface stuff, and did a real-time simulated mission liftoff still in the vehicle assembly building. When every system appeared to be functioning properly, then they got the go to roll out the vehicle assembly building to the launch pad.
Yeah, and this is where you get then, they've rolled everything out, they've got it on the launch pad, and then a sensor fails or something like that, and then stop, roll it back in again, or find out what's wrong with it, and then obviously do the whole thing again. Did that happen a few times?
It did happen. I was not there when we had one roll back in because something didn't test right in the final testing on the launch pad, but it did happen.
Right. So then obviously when you were actually there and you were at the launch, you were much closer to the actual launch because you were at the building where they assembled the actual rocket, and then they roll it out, and you say it's probably about a mile, something like that, to where the actual thing that is then lifts off. So at liftoff, you were much closer than the normal general public and all the cameras and everything like that, the TV cameras at launch. So what was the sensation like when you were that close to a Saturn V lifting off?
Well, it was a little bit different from what the general public was allowed to see, Paul, because we were a few miles closer, roughly a mile away probably, but it was an interesting phenomenon because the first thing you would see as the countdown proceeded was the fireball underneath the rocket. Now, the rocket's not moving yet, but the fireball is there. The ignition sequence is going through, and then after some seconds, you see the vehicle start to move upward, and you still haven't heard anything. But eventually, after some more seconds, it's like the sound of a locomotive or something. You'd hear the sound waves rolling across the water because it was water between us and the launch pad. And it was an unbelievable experience, especially the first time you experienced it. But it almost knocked you down. The sound waves rolling across the water almost knocked us down the first time. Yeah. After that, we used to brace ourselves against the sound wave. But it was kind of a unique experience to watch the thing slowly, and the Saturn climbed slowly, such a huge rocket. But it was something to see, and at the time, I can honestly say, we didn't think that much of it. I mean, it was what we did. It was part of the day's work, and it's only in looking back and in retrospect, Paul, that you really start to sense that there was something special about that.
Yeah, yeah. And in comparison to the Shuttle, the later systems, what were they like in sort of comparison of being there and having because obviously the Shuttle's a smaller vehicle height-wise, but it's still a very powerful system, a rocket with the two solid rocket boosters and then the main booster. And what was the main sort of difference between the two that you could sort of see, oh, wow, this is still some pretty awe-inspiring thing?
Yeah, I guess maybe the anticipation of it with the fact that you've got the vehicle attached to these huge rockets. Back in the Saturn days, you didn't have a vehicle attached like you had the shuttle vehicle attached to its boosters. It was a shorter lived thing because it lifted off faster and it entered faster. And it wasn't quite as impressive as far as the sound and the visual fireball of it. But there was also the sense of the investment, the expense, the risk involved. You almost got even more, I guess, a sense of appreciation for the crew and the people who really was on the firing line.
Exactly, yes, yeah. I mean, were you there for most of the launches, or was it only at certain points when you were sort of there?
It was just at certain points. We had a team of people, and I saw a good number of the old Saturn launches, and of course the Skylab and Spacelab business, and then a couple of the shuttle launches.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, you've been there at the actual front end in the assembly building. When the actual astronauts, they would come in. They would go into the actual the Saturn V, the command module, or into the shuttle itself. So, what would they be like? What were the people like who were at the front end? Were they the sort of like I say, what's the saying now? The right stuff. Would you say they were the right stuff?
Oh gosh, yeah, the crew and an awful lot of the science and the technology specific people. Paul, it was at that time probably the greatest gathering in our country of skills and expertise and just plain courage. Now those guys were something else. The tale goes around a lot about John Glenn, who was died recently, but he was a great astronaut. Those guys, they would monitor their pulse rate, and with that fireball fixing to ignite under them, John Glenn's pulse rate was a straight line. Unbelievable to me. Unbelievable these guys could sit up there. And none of them spiked on their pulse rates, their reactions. They knew no fear. I mean, they were test pilots.
Yes.
NASA knew when they got them in the program that fear would not be a factor.
Yeah, yeah. Anyone like us who's not quite the same, obviously you're going to sit there and think, oh my God, what's going to happen next?
Yes.
Am I going to make it out of this alive? But to them, it was just another day's job, really, I suppose.
They were awesome, and I just held them in the greatest respect. And at the same time, they're very human, Paul. I've stayed at that Holiday Inn down there with them. I've seen them throw each other in the swimming pool. And play like young boys. When we were working, when our liaison during the Space Lab days with the crew was a man named Bob Crippen. At that time, Bob had not flown a mission. Later on, at one time, he had the most hours in space of any human being. That was some time back. But Bob and his buddies, when they would come for a meeting on the Arsenal at Huntsville Marshall Space Flight Center, they would announce their arrival with a sonic boom. They would fly over our building, and we'd hear the windows would rattle and the big boom, and we'd know an hour later they'd walk in the door. Now, that probably violated every rule, every airspace, but those guys were so carefree, they felt entitled, and they for doggone sure were entitled, and that's the way they lived their lives. They just had to be different, or they wouldn't climb up there and get on top of that fireball.
No, I'd imagine so. That's what really sort of sets them apart from, obviously. Nowadays, it's much more, seems health and safety driven, or for obvious reasons. Yeah. But you do look back and you think, those were days where people sort of, it's like men were men sort of days, for want of a better word. Yeah.
Yes, I think you're right. It was kind of just the right time and place, maybe for those of us that were in support roles, but maybe especially for men out of the ranks of the test pilots, the front ranks of those people, is where they drew these special people that they called astronauts.
Yeah. Did you get to know many of the astronauts more personally, or didn't you get that much time with them apart from just being on the training job, really?
We met them, we worked with them, we were in meetings with them, we had discussions with them. But as far as knowing any of them personally, away from the field, now I've been down at the Cape Ball. Now these guys, they were known to bend an elbow every now and then. There was a watering hole down on A1A down there, or Highway A1. That was their favorite place, and we would go down there, and I guess I spent more personal time with them down at their watering hole when they would kind of relax and let loose a little bit. And they were, when you sat down with them and talked, they could be just like anybody, like the rest of us. But when it come time to put on the uniform, that's what separated them. They were different people then.
They changed and became the astronauts that we knew.
They on their cape.
Yeah,
absolutely.
The Supermen almost.
Yeah.
Okay, so you then sort of you were working on for Skylab, which Skylab was a repurposed Saturn V. I think it was going to be because they cancelled the Apollo missions after 17. It was going to be 18, 19, and 20, and really they had the hardware left over, but without much of a job to do. So then they said, okay, well, we'll use this to set up Skylab. So what was your role in the sort of Skylab project?
Well, again, the Skylab had a flight, the Skylab mission had a flight computer that's going to get them up there, that's going to control the vehicle in its liftoff and in its entry to orbit, and then control the vehicle itself in its orbits. But there was a separate computer to manage all those experiments that were in the bay that was going to be opened up and get a first look without having to look through the Earth's atmosphere for some of those experiments. That was a first opportunity. A separate computer controlled those experiments, stepped them through their different operational phases. So we had two computers to develop, the flight computer and the experiment computer. And the ESA guys had some of the experiments were ESA responsibilities, and the European Space Agency, and we worked with those guys a good deal. But and that was a long mission. We had a lot of nights of mission support during that time because Skylab was up for a long time. And we had to maintain some status of support during all of that time. Right.
So, obviously, now you then went on to Spacelab. Spacelab was the manned one. So again,
Right.
you would have been involved in training the crew on the systems, on how they were going to work. And I believe that we talked earlier about the Apollo guidance computer, that sort of ended up, did that end up as part of the control system for Skylab, Spacelab, and the sort of basis of the shuttle? Or was it then sort of dropped off and then IBM sort of took over it completely?
Well, it was sort of an adaptation. Each subsequent phase was kind of an adaptation of the previous phase. Used a lot of the same control laws, a lot of the internal logic, but there was modifications to all of that, and then additions of computer control stuff for the Skylab and Spacelab. And yes, we did. They were called PIs, principal investigators, but they were scientist astronauts.
Right.
They would train at Johnson Space Center to do the astronaut's role, to climb into the seat on the Fireball, and they would train at Marshall Space Flight Center to see the computer interface, what they were going to be doing and interfacing with, and we would train them. And I mentioned a couple of names, Bob Parker,
Yeah.
Owen Garriott. Those guys fit into that category.
Right. So you end up working on the shuttle, and again doing the same thing, training the crews on the system. Because obviously it's a 7-man crew on the shuttle. There's a lot more people involved. So there would be the pilot, and then there would be other people, and I suppose then there'd be mission specialists which would be brought on to do certain things, wouldn't there? So your job would be primarily dealing with the pilots and those sort of people who are flying the actual thing?
Yeah, the crew themselves, but also the mission specialists or the principal investigators. The answer is yes to that, Paul, but I had a short term on the shuttle. Only a year or two that I actually worked on the shuttle computers.
Right.
Which did, so I didn't get in as much of the training and the crew interface stuff, but I was on the early stages of the computer and software preparation.
Right. So, you mean the astronauts that came through, the most famous ones are the Apollo ones, obviously. Did you ever get to see any of those or meet any of those?
Well, I met a few of them. They when they came to Huntsville, either for some special training, because the normal training we went out to Johnson to do. I met them, but I never became socially familiar with them. It was strictly a work relationship, yeah. and it never really developed beyond that, except, as I mentioned, down at the Cape sometime, when we would be down at the whatever their favorite watering hole was.
Yeah. Now, Tennis was telling me that when you first started working for NASA, and obviously Apollo had been and gone by that, or was sort of in its sort of latter stages there, that you had some relatives, I think your grandparents, that didn't believe you actually have anybody been to the moon. And this, funny enough, still resonates around now, and probably even more so. And if you've ever read any of the comments on my channel, it's probably half of it is people saying we've never been there and it's all a big con, even though you've got all the evidence to the contrary nowadays. But what was it like having part of your own family thinking, oh, well, they've never been there?
Well, it has to do somewhat, Paul, with where I was from. Out in a rural area, the local people, they weren't as sophisticated as a lot of the big city folks and didn't have the TV access in some cases. But my grandparents were like 80 years old.
Right.
I went out of their house going to work every day. And a lot of times when I come home from work, I'd stop, and they were, at that time, sedentary people. They sat on the porch and watched the world go by. And I'd stop and visit with them and talk to them, and I'd tell them a little bit about what I was doing, not a lot. But they never believed that we put a man on the moon, even with me telling them that we did. And they would confide to aunts and uncles then that they didn't really believe me. And they were serious.
And they never did believe you till the end, did they?
They never, they didn't.
Never did.
They never did. They thought it was a pretense. They thought it was staged on their TVs to fool the American public. They had a little bit of distrust of government and that sort of thing left over.
So that sort of distrust and that sort of idea that things were not as they should be was really still was going around even in that would have been what, the late 60s, early 70s? Yes,
in that time frame we're talking about there. And again, particularly in the rural areas like I came from, I'm sure my grandparents were not the only ones that did not believe it, but they were the ones that probably had some reason to believe it because I was telling them that it was true.
You worked for the company, but actually did the job, and you saw them, you saw the rockets go. So, well, they're going somewhere. I don't know where, but they're going somewhere.
Yeah, but to them, IBM meant nothing. NASA meant nothing. Right. To them, it was just almost inconceivable, I guess, because it just wasn't what God meant to be or something.
Right. No,
must be how he did it.
Yeah. It's fascinating that obviously we all think that we think alike and we think that other people think the same. And then you talk to people and say, well, no, we don't believe it or this, that and the other. And obviously they have their own beliefs and whatever and how they actually get to those beliefs. But it's still, it sort of stretches the imagination of people like myself to sort of think, how do you not believe? And then of course other people would say, well, you're stupid to believe.
Yeah, exactly. It's the world we live in.
Yeah. I suppose so. And obviously even more so now with the internet, because obviously there's lots of ideas floating around about all sorts of different things. So hell, the world is full of conspiracy theories.
Absolutely.
So, is there anything in particular that you sort of would remember from your career and time at NASA? What would be your takeaway thought? If you were to say, God, there's one thing there I really thought was fantastic you took away, what would it be?
Well, maybe, Paul, the fact that we were young, most of us, I would imagine the average age of those guys was no more than 30 and possibly in the high 20s. It was young people, and, there was a famous British mathematician named Hardy that one time said that by the time you're in the late 20s, you're incapable of originating math. You can't do original mathematics because you've already peaked. But anyway, it was a young crowd of people, and the work ethic. I've told Tennis before that there's another friend of mine at IBM. We worked an enormous number of hours. There was a stretch one time that we worked 72 consecutive days without a day off, and those weren't 8-hour days either. Mm-hmm. We probably averaged 70 hours a week, and we just worked. And that's what we did. The work day was just about all day. And we had the energy. We were young enough to have the energy, I guess, and maybe young enough to be naive enough to think it was okay to do that.
Right.
But at one time in my group, and I don't know, this is not a very positive thing, Paul, but in the group that I worked in with 15 or 20 of us in this test and integration group, there was something like 14 had already gotten divorces.
That many?
It was a separation that was unbelievable, and at the time it didn't dawn on us. But in some years past and in reflection, it took a tremendous toll on the families involved.
Simply because you were just separated for so long.
Absolutely. It took you away from the things that maybe you should have been given a greater share of your time.
But at the time, obviously, you thought, well, this is it. This is the one shot, and we'll just give it all we've got.
So it's a two-sided coin. You paid a price for that, but it was a great experience. And again, at the time, you didn't attach all that much significance, but in looking back at it, you realize that you were very fortunate to have been at that time and that place.
Yes. but obviously you had the downside with the family bits, but the upside was that you were at a unique point in time. And if you were single, I'd imagine that's fine. It's more really the married people. So were you single at the time?
No, I was married at the
You were
time.
married. And did your marriage survive?
My marriage survived that, yes.
There you go. So you did. You got both sides, really. You had that unique opportunity, and you managed to save your family life at the same time.
You managed to preserve the family life, yeah.
Well,
yeah, I was.
Yes. Well, Kenneth, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and fascinating stories there. And I think that the viewers will enjoy this a great deal. I'd like to say thank you very much for coming on board.
I appreciate it, Paul. I appreciate the opportunity. I've enjoyed talking with you, and I've enjoyed hearing some of what you've done, and I'll continue to follow that. Tennis will keep me up to date.
Yes, certainly. And it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I did making it. And if you worked or do still work in the space or aerospace industry, or know someone that did and would like to share their stories, then please contact me on the YouTube email link on the About page. So it just remains for me to say thanks for watching, and please subscribe, rate and share.